Good afternoon, colleagues. It is just after 4 o'clock. Let's call the meeting to order. I'm looking for any disclosures of pecuniary interest, please. Councillor Helmer.
For clause number 5, For clause number 5, I don't have a pecuniary interest, but I do want to address something. One of the candidates is one of my contract assistants. I consulted with the Integrity Commissioner this afternoon. I've thought about it, and I don't actually have a pecuniary interest in that matter, but I did want to disclose it just in the interest of full transparency.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on in the agenda. This is, we've got a consent item. I'm not sure if there will be much discussion on the consent item. If there is, I'd like to deal with it after we deal with our timed items, since we've got people waiting. Did anyone want to discuss item 2? Okay, it's been moved by Councillor Usher, seconded by Councillor Zafman. That'll be up on screen in a moment. It's all set for you, Councillor. Thank you. And any speakers? Okay, let's call the question. We're voting.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 11-0.
Okay, colleagues, that brings us then to item 3. This is the scheduled item not to be heard before 4 p.m. It's the London and Middlesex Housing Corporation 2016 annual meeting of the shareholder annual resolutions. Mr. Brown, I believe I saw in the building. Oh, great. And Mr. Bazzelli. Did I say that correctly? Yes. And Ms. Easton. Nice to see you both. I'll hand things over to you. Mr. Bazzelli, you'll probably remember that it's the red button. And if you can relinquish the microphone when colleagues want to ask questions, it's much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. Appreciate it. Thanks very much. Mayor Brown, councillors, thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you our annual report. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by Marcy Allen Easton, who's the vice chair of the committee. I'm the chair of the committee, and I'm also joined by Josh Brown, who's here to help with any questions you might have after the presentation. I'd like to start off by thanking you for helping us to fill the 3 board appointments that we had vacant up until 2 weeks ago. We appreciate that. We are now running at a full capacity of 9 board members, which includes the council appointment of Anna Hopkins and Vance Blackmore from the county as well, so we appreciate that. This is one of a sequence of meetings we've had and aim to continue having with you in an ongoing dialogue about housing. We had an opportunity to meet the city manager a couple of months ago in his effort to reach out to boards and commissions to talk about some of the issues facing LMHC. We had Sandra Daters-Bear join our board meeting last month, and that was a very good and constructive conversation as well. And the annual general meeting is an opportunity for us to have an open and frank and direct conversation with you about the year that we've had. But what might be slightly different this year is that we'd also like to say a little bit about our plans going forward in the months and years ahead. One of the things that happens when we get together and have a discussion around housing is that we often lament many of the problems in the housing market. And we're a very demanding board when we have our meetings at LMHC. And I think you're also very demanding, as we learned last time from our SPPC meeting a month ago. And I think that's because the housing market is going through a very difficult time. And I think it bears saying at the outset that one of the things that we ought to do is remind ourselves, that is the city, LMHC, and other institutions like us, that we are actually part of the solution, not part of the problem. And we'll say more about that as we go through the presentation. The overarching theme here is that we're on the move. That's quite literally true about our experience in 2016, as I'll say in a moment. But it's also our hope and ambition as we go forward and talk about some of the things that we have in store, including our strategic plan, which Marcy will share with you. So 2016 in review, we come with you with a lot of good news, but we also come with you warts and all. And as I said, this is very much in the spirit of having an open and frank conversation about our experiences in the last year. We were very fortunate to have our new CEO come on board. That's Josh Brown, who many of you know, in August. But in the virtually a full year up to that moment, we were working in a very different kind of arrangement because our prior CEO departed at the end of 2015. And that meant that the board had to redouble its efforts during the course of that period, and always led by the steady hand of our prior chair, Gordon Saylor. We decided that what we would do is ask the 3 staff directors to form a tripartite leadership team and guide the corporation until such time that we would be able to appoint a new CEO. And that was done, I think, very, very admirably. So I'd like to extend congratulations and thank you to Andrea Topham. Please identify yourself. Andrea McKenzie. 2 of the 3, Paul Rozelle is on holiday, and he's the 3rd staff director. So that was done very, very well over the course of, it was almost 11 full months before Josh came on board. And as you might well imagine, without a dedicated leader, things can very quickly go pear-shaped, but they didn't. We held together. There were some things we had to put on hold, but certainly there were some other things that we did accomplish. The next image on this slide is our move to our new office space. So I said we were on the move, and it's quite literally true. When I first joined the board at the end of 2014, my first experience walking into the office was a bit of wonder and amazement at just how the staff were working in space that was clearly unsuitable for them in the old office space. We've moved out to Oxford East, Oxford and Highbury. And we are at a new location that is not only suitable for our staff, but also, I think, a plus for the tenants, should they have any reason to visit us. The plaza we're in is accessible on major bus routes. It's got free parking. There's a grocery store, there's other services, there's a walk-in clinic. So there's lots of things there for the tenants themselves, should they want to come to the office to visit us for any particular reason. So we're a new office space. I know many of you have visited and had a chance to see that. We had a launch last year as well. During 2016, we also had a very significant collaboration with London Hydro. And what this was a joint program to introduce energy efficiency upgrades to the appliances that our tenants have in the units right across the portfolio. And so tenants were given new LED energy efficient lamps, but also, probably more significantly, a 1-for-1 swap out of older appliances for newer ones. Those belonged to the tenants, but it also meant that we could have a significant reduction in our own carbon footprint across the 3,282 units that we manage. At our SPPC meeting last month, we had a very spirited discussion about the need for an even greater level of cooperation and collaboration in the community. And I think this example and some of the others that I share with you are things we're only too pleased to bring with you to tell you that that spirit is already actually baked into what LMHC does. The Booley Street renovation is one that really touches my heart. It's a renovation that was done for a family of new Canadians at the Booley Street site. That family has a child with that suffers cerebral palsy. And in cooperation with Make-A-Wish Foundation and the Thames Valley Children's Centre, we were able to significantly modify units so that that family could stay in the community. The children could continue to attend the same school. It meant that we could gut the main floor of the unit so that the child could have a bedroom connected to a bathroom, connected to a shower that was completely accessible given the mobility constraints. We also modified the outside of that particular unit so that the child could access the unit from the parking lot, but also have access to the common space in the complex just in behind the townhouse itself. There was a lot of coverage of that particular renovation, partly because of the partnerships, but also because of the effectiveness. But as the staff remind us so well, this is the kind of thing that we're always doing day to day at LMHC. It's not just a one-off. The last thing on this slide is the implementation of a new resource planning software package called HSC Insight. This package is obviously specific to property management. We implemented this actually beginning at the end of 2015 over the course of 2016. I think we stopped doing double entry in our old system and HSC Insight in January of this year. So we're fully onto a new system, and the reason why that's significant is because as we start to think forward about redevelopment and regeneration, this is the kind of information system that will allow us to make informed decisions about the scale and the timing and the geography of those kinds of investments going forward right across the region. So we had to put many things on hold in the absence of having a CEO for much of 2016, but at the same time, we did manage to move forward on many fronts. Just some numbers from our annual report. 210 saved vacancies through negotiated agreements. What that really means is alternatives to evictions. This is the work of our tenant administration team that works with tenants who are facing eviction for a whole host of reasons. And if you break that number down, what that amounts to is virtually one household saved from being evicted nearly every business day in the year 2016. If we average that out, for instance, to today, that means that if it hasn't happened today, it will very probably happen 3 or 4 times by the end of this week. So we're saving people from being evicted and keeping them in their homes. And at the same time, our staff is working on making sure that tenants have the right resources that they need. So we've got 651 referrals to partner agencies. So that's many times every single business day that our staff is dialoguing with different partner organizations. We've listed 56 different partners that we have. That was a question from SPPC last month. 56 different partners, which is not an exhaustive list, on page 9 of your annual report. We placed 495 new tenants last year. So that's several tenancies placed every day of the week. Those are new people coming in when units become available and they're eligible. And that's positive. At the same time, our community relations workers are working closely with tenants, existing tenants in our units, to investigate and resolve a whole host of issues for them. The community relation workers will offer short-term counseling to tenants. They'll refer them to other resources for longer-term counseling. They'll help them with their personal budgets. They'll help them in renegotiating their rental agreements if they're in arrears, a whole host of things to make sure that people are just sustainably housed going forward. So there's a lot of throughput in the work that we do. Another thing that we do, and that we did over 2016, is constantly scanning the environment for different kinds of programs we could take advantage of. So we felt just shy of $800,000 in energy efficiency rebates in various programs with the different utilities. So in a sense, that's revenue that's out there that we can't show on our books unless we take advantage. So we're always scanning for those kinds of opportunities, following through with them and making sure that those rebates come in for LMHC. At the same time, when tenants leave our properties, sometimes they're leaving units in conditions that can't be subsequently quickly occupied by new people on the wait list. And so we've had to undertake in 2016 460 restorations. So I mentioned on the previous slide 495 new tenancies. Well, 460 restorations. We try to turn those around as quickly as possible so that we can get people housed and also so that we can recommence collecting rent for that particular unit. Our asset team is also interested in making sure that we say that we had 14,000 plus completed repair and service orders over the course of the year. It bears saying that we have 56 full-time equivalent staff. So that's a relatively small number when you look at the amount of throughput on these slides. This is a very high-level picture of our revenue and expenditures over the course of the year. There's really only 2 points I'd like to make here, and I'm sure you'll have more questions. The first is that we ran a net deficit of $50,000 on a global budget of over 20 million. So we're looking at a deficit of about 0.2%. That actually would have been slightly higher had we not successfully appealed MPAC regarding the valuations of some of our properties in our portfolio. So that's been a long discussion and appeals process with MPAC, and finally came to successful conclusion last year. The business model is an extremely difficult and tight one. When you look at the revenues, most of that is rental revenue that is pretty well fixed, as is our municipal base funding. On the expenditure side, there's not a whole lot of control. We have over half of our expenditures, which is property taxes, insurance, and utilities, and nearly as little wiggle room around the other two big shares of that pie, which is building maintenance and repairs and salary and wages. So just north of 90% of our expenditures are expenditures that we don't actually have a whole lot of control of. So that's a very tight business model, but we're incredibly well run, notwithstanding those constraints. And this is just a quick snapshot that you have in your report regarding our capital improvements. And there's 2 quick points there. The first is that you'll see that we have a capital budget of 2.2 million for improvements of the type that you see across these categories. The 1.6 that you see spent there is capital spending that was actually spent during the fiscal year, which ended in December. Most of the rest of the 2.2 million is committed and either isn't spent because it's ongoing construction work, the nature of construction being what it is, or it's committed to be spent in a subsequent year as carryover. The biggest category is mechanical and plumbing. So we're keeping our buildings in good shape, as we reported last time, but there's a number of other things that we do there with our capital spending on security, interior improvements, exterior work, accessibility retrofits. I give an example of that, and life safety systems as well. So, thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Marcy.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Again, I'm Marcy Allen Easton. I'm the Vice Chair with LMHC. We know that there are several challenges with housing and delivering social housing. And at LMHC, we recognize as a landlord that many believe that LMHC doesn't necessarily care as well as they should for their tenants. In fact, it was just a few short years ago that I tossed my name in the ring to be a board member with housing. I had to look through the list. There was a long list, transit, library, and I came to housing and I thought, that's the place I should be, because as most of you, if you think back, can remember, I lived in housing for several years as youth, and I have a lot of family and friends who still to this day live in housing. And I came in on this board thinking they're doing a lot of things wrong that I need to get in there and fix. And I was pretty gung-ho, and I was pretty upset with housing and the way they ran things, because I was one of those Londoners who also believed that they didn't care about their tenants. But what I learned since in the past couple of years is that the resources are constrained at LMHC. And especially the past 12 years, they've been constrained by a directive that that LMHC needs to provide housing for what they call 9 of 10. It's a 9 of 10 rule, which means 90% of those housed come with a special priority, an urgent or a high need situation that they're living in. And this has resulted in LMHC properties having an extremely high proportion of tenants with urgent needs. Essentially, LMHC is funded to act as a property manager only. They've struggled to provide supports for folks with complex issues, including severe mental illness that in some situations is exacerbated by substance use and street-level behavior. LMHC has not been funded to practical levels. They've not been funded to provide these essential services, and the strain on the organization has been significant. It's negatively impacted LMHC's ability to be proactive in serving the tenants and our ability to fully support sustainable housing. It's also negatively impacted the public's perception, and we recognize this. It's the trust and credibility of LMHC that's been at peril. This fact has been extremely frustrating and demotivating for staff because they've been working over a decade to fully support their tenants, and they have very few resources, but they still do it, and they really do care. And if anything, that's been the main lesson I've learned since joining the board. It's filled with staff that care deeply for their tenants, care deeply for their properties. It's the resources that are short. They're part of what makes housing work well. And if we don't offer solutions, then we become part of the problem. LMHC has managed to maintain its capital assets at a level that the industry would consider in good condition. However, LMHC's success in this regard will be challenged in the very near future, as you all learned just a few short weeks ago while we were here last. With its aging infrastructure and current level of capital funding, there's now need. But now is not the time to panic, but the time to plan. We have to address the short and long-term challenges of escalating maintenance, repairs, and capital replacement. As previously reported at the SPPC, the 2016 Building Condition Assessment Report shows 2-year FCI renewal cost of $56.8 million, with a total requirement cost of $223.8 million over the next 5 years. The underlying reason for the significant increase is that LMHC owns a large percentage of buildings that were constructed around the same time, and therefore all are aging at similar rates. This has created a tidal wave of expected renewals coming due at the same time as a result of systems aging out at the same time across many of our buildings. We also know that based on the VFA report, that we don't have the luxury to spend the next 2 to 3 years in planning. We need to deliver outcomes and demonstrate progress now. As such, LMHC staff will be forming a multifaceted project team in the very near future that includes HDC, city facilities, building and division planning to start the process of redevelopment of at least one of our sites. We've just completed our 2017 to 2020 strategic plan. The planning was robust. It included input from our tenants, LMHC staff, city administration, members from city council, as well as several community partners. We're entering a new era in housing, one that demands a high degree of collaboration and innovation as we critically examine how buildings are designed, built, and maintained. LMHC's sole reliance on public funding to meet escalating needs is not a financially sustainable approach. I'd encourage everybody to read our new strat plan as it contains some great information on where we've come from and what we need to do over the next 3 years to support our community better. Our new mission and vision was created to redirect us from the norms of the past and recognize that we need to add the social aspects and supports to the current role of property management. Our mission now, we provide and maintain homes in a safe and supportive environment to meet the needs of the people we serve in our community. And our vision going forward is we envision healthy homes and communities in London and Middlesex. Leading by example, LMHC will help make a difference and positively impact lives using housing as the foundation. These are our values. The new values of LMHC have intrinsic meaning that will direct the extrinsic actions and behaviors of the LMHC team. The slogan, "We Care," sums up and sets the new strategic direction. These are our 7 new strategic goals. Presented, they will guide us as we reimagine, reposition, and reinvent LMHC from a property manager to a housing provider that cares. That's the rule. That's the way we want to move forward. In the current economic and political environment, traditional public housing models and service delivery methods are strained beyond any acceptable limits. As such, LMHC will respond to these new and shifting challenges, turning challenges into opportunities. We will reposition LMHC for success, by creatively seeking alternate financing tools and revenue streams to better maintain the homes we offer, improve our supports, and invest in our people. We'll focus on the effectiveness of our operations by identifying and maximizing opportunities for innovation, implementing lean approaches, and technology that will improve our services and our communications. Our strat plan will change our role in the community by aligning the type of scope and support services that we will engage, assist, and empower with our teams and our tenants. We will ensure that social and affordable housing is fully considered and represented in the political process by accepting our responsibility to advocate on behalf of our tenants and community partners. These strat initiatives will reinvent and refocus the way we manage our assets, support our tenants, and grow our portfolios. Our new plan will build our reputation and establish trust and confidence in our organizational growth and capacity. With our new leadership, our strong board, and a committed staff and guidance from these goals, LMHC will rise to new heights and we will make a difference. Part of our objective to engage, empower, and support tenants is to become advocates for those who live in our communities. Our tenants often deal with similar faulty perceptions and stigmas. As we as an organization have experienced firsthand and heard the stories, this video is a small clip from a larger project that we're currently working on to help showcase some of the amazing people who have made their homes with LMHC.
I can remember somebody saying all the drug addicts and alcoholics and losers in housing.
I don't think that I would be where I am today without being a recipient of London Housing.
I was 4.5 years old, and I was on a tricycle. My mother went in the house, and I took the tricycle across the street, and the lady wasn't paying attention when she turned the corner and she hit me.
I had a stroke in the year 2000. I have a brain injury, and I'm paralyzed on the left side.
She dragged me 25 feet under, and the doctor said I was very lucky to be alive.
There's been some really rough patches, and you know, I would have ended up on the street. I don't even know. I mean, it would have broken up my family.
And I made the comment, I said, some of us are not drug addicts or alcoholics.
But I do pretty good in life, you know. Yeah, and I'm enjoying life. I always smile and everything.
But we fell on hard times, and it could happen to you.
It's actually really hard to even think of what it would have been like without having housing there to help me out. So I'm very grateful that it's there. So yeah, it's made a really big difference in my life.
Just go to the next one, it's fine. Social housing has come a long way from when I was young, but we know there's still room to grow. I was chatting with a friend of mine just a few days ago, and she was another young child that grew up in social housing, and she told me a story about how when she was young, she used to tell everybody that she lived in La Rentos. It sounded pretty neat, and that's how she knew it. She didn't realize that when people were speaking, they were saying low rentals. She always thought it was a fancy place to live in La Rentos. Times have changed since then. It's not low rentals now, it's social housing. But as I said, there's still so much room for improvement. Navigating the difference between supportive, social, affordable, and various other types of housing gets extremely complicated. I know I've spent time with many of you, and we've talked about the differences, and still, even I have a hard time sometimes understanding what each one means in each aspect of the list. The term affordable housing can mean so many things. Fundamentally, affordable housing is based on a percentage of market rate, while social or RGI housing is based on income levels of tenants. Simply put, affordable housing is not affordable for many of our tenants. We are funded to provide housing at a deeply subsidized rate for the most vulnerable members of our community. So thank you for allowing us to speak today. Appreciate the time.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. And I'd like to open it up for questions and comments at this time. Mr. Brown, welcome as well. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Squire.
First of all, I want to thank you very much. Marcy, I've known you for a long time. You used to kick me around the soccer field a little bit when I wasn't behaving as a coach, and I probably needed that, and it's nice to see you again. And I really appreciate over the last year and a half how you've come to us and sort of painted the picture for us and got us to this point where we really, I think, have a better understanding of where you are and where you might want to go. So I wonder, through the chair, if you could help me a little bit with where we're going to go, because when I look at the financial information, I see you ran a deficit this year, and I know it's very hard for you to accumulate funds. So as you move forward and you have these huge capital requirements, can you, and I haven't had a chance to look at your strategic plan because it was just sitting on my desk when I came in, can you help paint at least a broad picture of how you're going to sort of recapitalize your inventory, create new inventory? How are you going to do that so that you avoid sort of falling into this continuous situation where you have this old inventory?
Great, and thank you. Thanks for the question, and through the chair. I think the biggest piece of that in answering is recognizing that we can't do it alone as an organization. Part of our strategic plan is saying, and exactly what you heard tonight is saying, continue to come back to the city as a sole shareholder and ask for money is not a sustainable model for us moving forward. So we have to be innovative. We have to think outside the box. We have to work with civic administration to close that gap, but also with the new Housing Development Corporation, and you'll hear from them next in terms of how we do that together. We have the data through the VFA report. Now we simply have to do the planning piece, recognizing that we don't have the luxury to do this over 3 years, but certainly we need to do it in collaboration and in partnership.
Just anticipating that you're going to have those meetings, when do you think, in terms of a timeline, we'll be hearing back as to what your plan is, whether it involves asking us for some capitalization or providing us with information as to where you're going to get that?
Certainly through the chair. We've had initial discussions with civic administration around a small capital ask for this year in terms of a budget amendment. So that will be part of us coming forward in the summer and the fall, and you'll hear more about that as a business case. The partnership with the HDC is certainly something we want to make sure that we do and do it quickly. And we're hoping, because part of the phase 2 of our strategic plan is looking at those implementation plans. So we're going to take the next 6 months to do that, and certainly planning with the HDC is part of that. So I'm hoping to have and to be back in front of council by the end of the year.
Councillor Zafman.
Thank you, and through the chair, I appreciate all of you being here today. Thanks for the great presentation. One of the questions that came to mind for me, and it's sort of come up in my mind a few times over the last couple of years, is seeing, obviously, I think a significant amount of expenses that have to go into repairs and upkeep for properties. And so if we were, say, over the next 5 years, council was able to somehow come up with the full amount of money and we could rehabilitate and revitalize the entire housing stock that LMHC has, is there any idea of how much that would decrease in annual operating expenses for the organization?
Through the chair, I wish I could provide that information to you tonight. We simply just don't have that. Part of what's going to come out of that strat plan is to have a financial plan that ties in our operating and capital, and certainly looking at whether and what we do with our buildings on the capital side is going to impact on our operations. There's no doubt. We just don't have that number at this point for you.
Through the chair, thanks for that. And the reason I ask is because I think there is a very obviously a real relationship with that. And so if we invest more in capital, if there's less in expenditures, then maybe we wouldn't be having the surpluses that the city, or deficits, sorry, that we would have to cover, and the county would have to cover. Just a question of how much that would be. So just curious. Thanks.
Councillor Ridley.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and again, I really haven't looked through the strategic report that was on our desk here. One is around, what is the average length of tenancy with London Middlesex Housing? Is that a figure that you would have?
A great question, and I would ask if we do have that information, that our Director of Tenant Administration may be able to answer that for you. If not, we can certainly provide that at a later time.
I'll step over to the microphone. I apologize. I can get that information for you. I track currently the length of tenancies when tenants are vacating, but I don't track on an ongoing basis the length of tenancies with ongoing tenants, but certainly happy to get that for you fairly quickly.
Just an added note to that, when we start looking at housing stability, part of what we do and what we want to track is certainly that, right? So the better job that we can do at the front end, not only in terms of training, but supporting tenants as they come in, the less likely we're going to have to spend on the back end. And that certainly goes to Councillor Zafman's point about the connection between operating and capital. But we can certainly provide that to you.
Thank you. I think it would be interesting, and I assume that the goal is that tenancy within social housing is not a lengthy period of time, but rather people are transitioning along the continuum, recognizing that every situation is different for every person. And so I actually wanted to ask about moving people along the continuum in that framework of tenancy. Is that one of the outcomes and goals within the strategic plan, is that people will use emergency housing when necessary, move into that housing continuum, and eventually move into market rental and home ownership? Is that one of the goals identified by the board?
I think, sorry, through the chair, I think the first part, social housing is, as I mentioned earlier, it's often based on income, and a lot of our tenants are with us on disability and Ontario Works, so we know, let's face it, history says that often that's generational, and so is social housing. Often it's generational. And part of breaking that is, frankly, making it a better place to live. So that I'm not, when I'm a tenant, I'm not, I don't believe that that's where I belong forever. So, you know, investing in social housing and making social housing comparable with housing across the street, a townhouse down the road that looks just the same, is incentive for people to want to move. But when you, and I think, you know, you've heard this before, when you put a child in social housing and social housing is not in the best position or the best shape, they grow up believing that's where they should be, that's what they have earned, and that's where they belong. And it's hard to change that stigma. So it's something that everybody would like to see changed, but absolutely resources are a big part of that.
Thank you. My other question, I didn't have a chance to write down, but one thing I've been thinking about is typical profiles and typical families. We know that families are very different than perhaps the nuclear family idea. And so does Lunamsux housing accommodate different family styles? I'm thinking in terms of cultural difference in multi-generational families that want to stay together, or are we looking at 2 and 3 bedroom for you know, adult and child, or single adult housing? So are we starting to expand how we're seeing families and family units in terms of how people want to be housed? Is that something that is planned moving forward, knowing a lot of our stock is dated from a time when a nuclear family model for multi-people tenancy would be designed?
Thank you, through the chair. The majority of our bedrooms are 1 bedroom. And the piece with the tenancy and trying to accommodate people, we do have local occupancy rules. So we have to align the type and the size of the unit to whether or not they're eligible for that unit. So you simply just don't want to put a one individual in a 3 to 4 bedroom unit. But do we see the need for that? Absolutely. As we look at what we do with our capital and our assets and how we go and redevelop them, will that be part of the solution? Potentially. But when we look at the wait list and statistically, what we see is there's a huge need for 1 bedroom units. So, but we will certainly look at whether or not there's a need there and provide different forms of housing. I think in my mind, the old form of public housing simply doesn't work anymore. We can't continue to put people in buildings without support that have multiple complex needs in one location and to hope that they're successful in that. So part of what we want to do is to take the stock that we have, use it as a foundation, and that's directly into our mission and values and what we're doing, and using that as a foundation to lift people up out of poverty, for sure.
And if I can expand a little bit more, because I think we're talking in the same direction. So people who are looking to live in a roommate situation versus a single adult situation, looking at ways to accommodate that, is that beneficial to the corporation rather than having two single one-bedroom units, having a two-bedroom unit that's shared by people who choose to be roommates? And on that same vein, when you have young adults who are attending post-secondary school, looking at, a separate suite style so that they can continue to live at home and attend school, or people who have aging parents and want to incorporate them into their housing, or are those things that are going to be looked at as we look at the future of housing?
Through the chair, there will be some required change locally in terms of the priority system and the local rules, but we would certainly support that and working towards that. And that's something we've obviously identified in our strat plan as well, is that we need to be and think of housing a little bit differently. And that's working with civic administration around those local rules. But at this point in time, those things really fall under the eligibility piece. The other thing when you talk about roommates, certainly we do that. We allow that if they come in and they can go on the lease. Because the rent itself is geared to income, both people would actually be considered in that calculation, and then that's how the rent would be established. But certainly something we would look forward to in the future in terms of changing how we use housing and who's eligible and how do they get in. So, thank you.
Thank you. I have a few other speakers. I have Councillor Usher, Van Holst. I know that Councillor Hopkins wants to speak at the end as well. Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, thanks very much for the presentation. I have to tell you that I've sat here for many years and I've seen many presentations come forward, and this is the one that's moved me more than any other because of the way you presented it. And it seems as though from my perspective that we're taking a different, I don't want to say a better, because I don't want to put down past people, but we're moving on into a different era, it sounds to me. And I applaud you for that. Some of the things I understand, some I still don't. Like you could experience this and you still live it, but it's so complex that unless you're there day after day, like the staff who experience all the different people, it's very difficult to absorb it all. Some of my concern, though, is that what I don't see, and I think that this is what you're trying to do, what I don't see in the past is that we take people into this so-called social housing, which we used to call low rental. And many times I see people feel very comfortable to just stay there. And they just stay there for years and years. And these are people, from my perspective, who I know could do better. So, and I'm talking about the ones who could do better. Is there a way that you're going to be able to empower them through this program to say, let's move on? There's a house out there that you could purchase. You can afford this now. I hope I make myself clear here.
Through the chair. Part of what we recognize now is that LMHC is not just a landlord. And for a long time, that's what we, not only were we considered just a landlord, but I think, the city also considered us a landlord. But we know now that that's no longer possible. So we also have to be a supportive housing, a supportive housing organization. So we have to provide supports to our tenants, supports whether it's directly from LMHC or whether it's working with outside organizations to become part of our team or part of our group. And some of the supports that we can look at in the future, and definitely on the list of things that we need to do, are organizations that will help people, that will help lift their spirits and make it a community, so it's not an isolated piece. And I think we also, again, have to realize that when we say people are comfortable, it's based on income. So by saying that, it's like saying that you're comfortable with your income as well. Because I can tell you that if they had more income, they probably wouldn't be in social housing. So that's always got to be recognized as part of the issue, is that, let's face it, supportive income is low, and it puts people in social housing. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we can give them all the support they need so that when they're ready to move, they can. But that ready step has to come from making sure that they have all of the supports they need in place, not just what LMHC can give them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it certainly does. Thank you. Through you again, Mr. Chair. You hit the nail on the head that one of the things that has always bothered me is that I've listened to the organization coming and say, we are basically a landlord. And I'm glad that you pointed that out because I didn't want to say it. It seems to me that you're trying to move a little bit further than just being a landlord. So you mentioned at the beginning, the chair mentioned at the beginning that we're working with the various organizations such as the HDC and the staff and so on. Can you enlighten me a little bit more? Because it seems to me that, through you, Mr. Chair, that you can't do it by yourselves. And what I mean by yourself is London Middlesex Housing. You need the support of the other housing entities within this complex of our city. Can you enlighten me a little bit more as to how you will accomplish this? Because I think that's needed.
Thank you, through the chair. Certainly, I don't want to steal any of the thunder that the HDC is going to come forward with in their annual report, because they can get into much more detail in terms of the services that they provide. For us, and recognizing that they're relatively new in this as well, so there's some learning on both organizations. We have never gone forward in terms of redeveloping any one of our sites. We've never been in the affordable housing space and creating new housing, which I think we need to be involved in when you talk about the continuum of housing and offering people places to move within our organization. To go to the question around how we're going to do that, I think the piece is really around taking, like I said, with the information that we have in the VFA and the data, look at what is going to be the best piece in terms of the property or the buildings to start to take a look at in terms of what redevelopment would really mean and really look like, and creating that multifaceted team to do that work. We don't have all the expertise in-house, but certainly that's part of the thing we'll be looking at over the next few months. So hope that answered your question.
Wonderful. I appreciate that very much. So one of the other things that I ran into over the years, and you hinted on it, you said that the majority of your units are one bedroom. And I have experienced so many times that you've got tenants who are in one bedroom, but they need 3 bedrooms now. Or they've got 3 bedrooms, but they need 5 bedrooms now. And you always have difficulty placing them. And yet they need to be placed under this context because their income, as you said, was always very low. Is that going to change in any way whatsoever so that you will be able to accommodate larger families rather than just individuals or couples? In other words, families with 2, 3 children. Is that going to change?
Through the chair, very difficult to and very expensive to change the size and types of the units that we do have. I think it's part of the conversation we need to have when we look at redevelopment and what that means and how do we create mixed income communities. Certainly part of what we do internally is looking at internal transfers, recognizing that things change within a household, people move away or people are added or they come with a large family. So we have to do our best in terms of meeting that need within the portfolio we have, but I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's go to Councillor Van Holst and then Helmer.
Thank you very much. I've got a bit of 3 questions. The first one is on intensification. So just wondering how your efforts at regeneration might be able to help out with our plans for intensification in the city.
It's a good question. I realize that you've just only received the strategic plan. Once you've had some time to look through it, you'll see that there's considerable alignment between the plan we're presenting to you and some of your own plans around poverty reduction and youth and physical planning as well. to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure that we think first and foremost about the goal of intensification when we think about our own needs for regeneration and redevelopment. We're only at the beginning stage now of thinking about what we need for our tenants. But certainly, any extent to which we can align what we're doing with what it is that you need to achieve, and combining those efforts is something we'd be open to. But we're not very far down that road in terms of the intensification issue specifically.
Okay, thank you. You talked about saving tenancy every business day, but you've also, I noticed, done about 2 restorations every business day. And I'm wondering if there's a way to implement your regenerations in a way that cuts down on that cost. Do you see some openings there?
I can see that Josh probably wants to say something as well, see if I cover it off, but I'm sure you'll have something to add. If you think about an analogy with transportation, I'm sure your transportation division would be loath to see the same segment of road dug up twice because 2 different utilities need access to the space underground. There's lots of moving parts when you're talking about, at first blush, regeneration that looks fairly obvious at unit A or complex A, but because of a whole range of moving parts, the tenants themselves, the age of the building, what specifically needs improvement in terms of the capital, that at first blush A looks like the obvious place to start with some of that activity, but actually B might make a lot more sense, and that might bring the cost reduction that someone asked about earlier. So it takes very careful analysis. We've implemented this HSC Insight software package that allows us to do more of that tracking in a more inclusive way. And so we're just at the beginning phase of that, but that would be certainly one of the goals, is to look at, if at all possible, the optimal way of making those investments to reduce overall costs.
Thank you. And if I may, through the chair, perhaps a question to our staff. $223.8 million. Do we have some ideas or how we might approach a financial challenge such as this?
Ms. Barbone.
Similar, I guess, to how we've approached the City of London's asset management gap. We've gone through and we've done incremental, small amounts towards the reserve fund to be able to start building towards where we need to go. And to use Mr. Hayward's philosophy, we've tried to stop the bleeding and try to keep building from there. So certainly we would recommend using a similar strategy, and we would work with LMHC if they put forward a budget update amendment to put that through and work towards looking at the multi-year budget to find financing for the City of London as a whole and continue with our infrastructure gap, closing it.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. In the presentation, there was a reference to alternative financing for some of the regeneration, I imagine. I wonder, without getting into it in great detail, what you mean by that?
Through the chair, it's really about how do we leverage our current assets to pay for new builds or new redevelopment. Certainly when closing that gap, part of it is to take, and when we redevelop a site, it's going to the bank, for example, in terms of getting a loan. So you want to be able to create communities that are self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and models that work. So when you talk about reducing the operating needs, certainly that's part of the equation. So hopefully that answers some of that question.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm looking in the financial statements, and you came in quite a bit under on natural gas costs in 2016. I imagine that is a one-time thing that you're not going to benefit from again in the future. I just wonder if you could speak to natural gas as a component of your operating costs and where you think that's headed.
Certainly through the chair, the biggest difference in terms of the natural gas and the reduction that we've seen was due to the warmer winter we did have last year. Certainly, I don't think the consumption was gone down that much. And we do purchase, we bulk purchase it through HSC. So the costs are relatively static. It really comes down to consumption and then obviously the impact of the weather, which we don't have any control over.
Thank you. I know as part of our budget amendment for this year, around cap and trade. We had an allocation for London Middlesex Housing Corporation somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000 to help with the natural gas impacts that would come from cap and trade being implemented. I imagine part of it is just the commodity price of natural gas too, which obviously you don't have a lot of control over. I just looked in 2016, it was quite a bit lower, but now it's starting to go back up in 2017. You know, the variability is quite significant. Like it's down 20% from what you budgeted, and then it could, this year it looks like it might be 20% over what you budgeted. And that's why I was asking the question. I realize you're working with very tight margins, and those that kind of variability can be really difficult if you don't have a stabilization reserve fund or what have you for utilities. I know in our initial multi-year budget, we allocated an average annual increase for Middlesex Housing, London Middlesex Housing, around 4.5%. And then last year, we slight increases to that with the last budget amendment that you came in for. It seems to me like really the significant cost pressures on the capital side versus the operating side. I realize the operating side is very tight too, but I wonder if you could just speak to that, where you think the future needs will be, and frankly, where this budget amendment's going to be coming in. Is it more on the capital side or more on the operating side?
Certainly through the chair. You're absolutely right in terms of where the risk and where the majority of the increases that we experience, given the age and the infrastructure of our buildings, and also the impact that tenants do sometimes have in terms of just the units and the wear and tear on those units. We certainly have seen an increase and continue to see an increase in terms of building maintenance. So that is why we came forward last year without a budget amendment. We certainly expect to spend that money this year in those categories.
One last one. There was a reference, I think it was Ms. Easton who mentioned it, about the 90-10 rule, and I just was reading through the strategic plan. Obviously, I'll read it in more detail, but I see that that's from a directive from 2005. I looked up that directive and read it over during the meeting here, and do you have a sense that that directive is still hitting the right priorities, or 12 years in, should we be talking about changing it? I realize it doesn't just apply to London Middlesex Housing Corporation, but a variety of housing providers in the city.
Through the chair, it absolutely does pertain to all of the social housing providers in the city. Obviously, we're the largest, so the impact that we've seen as a result of that 9 and 10 rule has been significant in terms of the tenant mix and the change over the years. Does it align? In my personal opinion, I would say no. I think the reason for that is that the city has moved to a housing first model, where you're actually putting people into units with wraparound supports. So the biggest challenge for us as a provider is and a lack of information around what those actual supports are required coming into social housing. So they apply to the list, they apply to the access center, they go through an eligibility process. We select from that list without really understanding what the need is in terms of support. And I think that's part of what you'll see in terms of where we're going in our SRAP plan, is to really look at education, onboarding. How do we do that? How do we better know and understand and support our tenants, whether we do that internally or whether we go out and making sure they have the information and the supports they need from the very get-go, rather than responding after the fact when there's crisis that happens, and sometimes it's just too late at that point. So,
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Your Worship. That sort of segues right into where I wanted to go, actually. So I know when you were before us in the fall with the budget update, you spoke about that whole idea of the capital costs being such a huge part compared to operating. And I think what you told us back then was that was out of necessity. It wasn't necessarily that you didn't want to spend money on the operations. It's just the buildings are deteriorating, and because of the clients that you serve, that 90% being high priority tenants with multiple complex needs, that also feeds into that the need to refurbish and regenerate those units once they're vacated. So my question is about the housing first model that the world is moving to, and that the city does as well. And I'm wondering how you collaborate, like do you work with city staff to provide those wraparound supports? Because I know from looking at what's happened in other cities and in other jurisdictions that we reduce that strain and that wear and tear on the units when tenants have those wraparound supports. And so there would be, to me, it seems there would be a balance, that if we have tenants in there with wraparound supports, not only do we have greater housing stability, not only do we have tenants staying in housing for longer durations, which is good for these high priority clients, but then also when they're vacated, there theoretically would be less damage to the housing stock. And so we wouldn't have those long periods where we have to fix the units up before we can get a new person in there.
So currently, as I mentioned earlier, we up until now consider ourselves as landlord only. So although we worked with the Housing First folks in town to provide the housing, we didn't provide the supportive side. We left that at their hands and up to them. And that's, you know, up for mixed reviews for the most part. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone. And keep in mind, we're not funded at the current time. We're not funded to provide the social supports. So that's something that we have to look at and change and request in the future. But the goal eventually would be that, I guess before I go there, I just want to also point out that we know, even though this has been a directive for the past 12 years, we have to recognize in London that the supports for some of our community members in those high needs are higher today than they were in the past. And, you know, you can look at the issue we have with addictions and mental health, and I could go on, but those needs are higher in London, so those needs become higher in LMHC as well. So I think it's something that part of our strat plan is to look at how we provide those supports so that in the future, when tenants do leave, they had the supports along the way. That hasn't been the case now, and we recognize that because, like I said, we've been a landlord for so long, but we know that's something that has to change in the future, and we have to work more with being part of those supports as opposed to just leaving it in the hands of the folks who place the tenants.
Thank you for that. And so I'm excited about the collaboration that we hopefully will be hearing about later on with the Housing Development Corporation, because I think obviously you two are closely aligned, your two organizations in what you're doing. And as far as being a landlord versus a support provider of supports, I also see a real value in collaboration there as well with the things that our own city staff are doing and other organizations in the community. You know, we've seen, we're coming to the realization, we have come to the realization as a society that the siloed approach doesn't work. So if we have a group over here doing supports for people in housing, and then you over here being property manager, landlord, and also provider of supports, I can see how you know, there could be problems with that model rather than bringing everybody together and working together and making sure everybody's is getting the support that they need.
Just through the chair, in terms of a follow-up to your question around how do we practically move this forward, I think I definitely want to recognize the work that the Housing Division under Ms. Daters-Beers does on an ongoing basis, and within their housing division, there was a lot of work done back in 2005 to get to that point around the policy piece, around our priority system. So I want to recognize that, and I certainly think that we're committed to that, not only now as a housing provider, but as civic administration is looking at doing that type of work and aligning policy as it relates to the housing piece and the housing side of things with what we're doing on the homelessness side and around Housing First.
Any other speakers? I want to give Councillor Hopkins the last word. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. First off, I've had the chance through the discussion to flip through the strategic plan. And the first thing I'll say about that is, I know this is the annual general meeting of the shareholders. We have some resolutions and formal things, but I really appreciate you bringing the scope and type of information to us today for us to have, even though obviously, even with me just looking at it today, very, very surface level. In that strategic plan, just even skimming through it, I think there's some very exciting things. And I think what I would like to hear your response to is where you see the engagement with the city and the council and the shareholder, particularly on the strategic plan. I know that you have a very detailed strategy to implementation, and you've got a lot of work to do to kind of, go through the changes, develop the roadmap, and then attempt to implement the solutions. But as you dig into the performance at a glance document, you can see that there's lots of places that you're going to start to move into that the city has expertise in, has connections to partners, has connections with government. One of these is lobbying the government to change some of the legislation, ways to engage tenants. Obviously we have some experience with engaging the public and stakeholders. What role do you see, and what sort of conversation do you see us having outside of this presentation, which isn't about the strategic plan, on your strategic plan moving forward? And would you envision us coming together to talk about that at some point after we've all had a chance to read and digest it?
Well, obviously, we come to you in a spirit of collaboration, so it's difficult to be specific. The tenant engagement piece is something that's very, very new. So we're a 16-year-old corporation. I don't think there's been significant inroads made up to this point in the history of LMHC in tenant engagement specifically. And we would certainly look to the city and its expertise in public engagement in doing that kind of work. Obviously, many of our tenants, all of our tenants are your constituents. So I think it serves both of us to leverage whatever expertise is on both sides of the table and whichever other partners are out there. There's already a degree of shared services that we have with the city, and we do a lot of that, and I think Josh could probably speak to a lot of the different ways that already happens. I don't know if you wanted to, did you want to add?
I think one of the points to come forward is that it's embedded in terms of our value system, what you're talking about around caring, with C being the term for around collaboration and commitment. So we certainly need to work in partnership, recognizing, like I said before, that we can't do this work alone. We do a lot of work, some informally, some informally with the city in terms of shared services. We're certainly looking forward to having PwC come back in the summer months and taking a look at some of the work we do and how do we leverage not only the people we have in implementing the strategic plan, but how does the city connect into that as well? So certainly those conversations will continue to happen and very much appreciated.
Thank you. So I'm going to make a comment on the strategic plan because I'm not sure when we would have a forum to talk about it as a group again. I want to commend you, particularly on the section that you just mentioned, which I did have a chance to read through, and that's to engage, assist, and empower tenants. I think that's a really positive step. I think the way and the approach that you're going to engage in trying to, you'll pilot some things, you'll work on new ways to provide opportunities for tenants to engage, to move beyond a property management corporation in the ways that you are intending to move beyond. I think that's a really key piece of your strategic plan, and I'm glad to see it emphasized in such an important way in the plan. And so I think that's something that we've discussed, you've teased about and said it's coming and we want to do this. I think the way that you've laid it out from my initial view, I think is going to be really progressive. I think you're going to get a lot of good data. I think you're really actually going to empower some tenants to have mechanisms to give feedback in ways that they've never had before. So I think that's a really great section. It's something pretty exciting. And the reason why I asked where's our opportunity to talk about this is because I think there are some really exciting things to talk about. I think some of the questions today that you've heard from some of my colleagues are in part answered in how you address the strategic plan and you're moving through the implementation and the scoping out of the different strategic goals that you've outlined. So I think that's really great. Certainly in this council, you have a partner in any way possible to support the activities that you'll go through in your strategic plan, and I want to be there to help in whatever way I can, because I think you have lofty but very noble goals in the transition of this organization from just a property management corporation into something more that will, with the people who are our constituents and your clients kind of at the heart of that. And I think that that's, you know, you're not going to go wrong if that's the direction that you go. And I know that there are all the challenges and the, you know, the finances that we've discussed, but I think, you know, when you have the right core principles at heart, we're really going to be able to make some progress together. So I really commend you on the work that you've done, and I'll really look forward to going through this in some more detail and maybe asking you some questions at a future date on it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the comment. I meant to add to my answer earlier that one of the key pieces, maybe not necessarily the most exciting, but something that's fundamental, we've only started the conversation on this, is a discussion around changing the framework within which we operate, which is the shareholder agreement. So it's not the most gripping text that you'll read, but it's something that has to change in order for us to operate in the kinds of lofty ways you've referred to. Certainly some of the things that we want to be able to do are very difficult to do under the current agreement. So that conversation has started, and we look forward to continuing it with you.
Just one final comment based on that. Not that I want to go back and forth. I agree with you completely. And I think we have the annual shareholders meeting, and some of this is working forward. So I know that, you know, if there's something we need to do sooner than on an annual basis to make updates to those, I believe there's mechanisms to do that. And I think you just need to let us know and through Civic Administration, and we would certainly be willing to make those adjustments or at least consider them when necessary. It seems like when you look at the planning document, I'm not sure what your timelines are, but if that's something that's necessary, I know that certainly, you know, I would be willing to engage in that discussion when the time is needed to make those updates as necessary.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the board members here and our CEO and staff for the presentation. I've been reflecting here my time on the board, and I know as a board we've faced many, many challenges throughout the past few years, and we've come through, and I want to thank you for that as well, and for staff for their commitment and their dedication to London Middlesex Housing Corporation. As we move forward, we'll still have a number of challenges. Change is not going to happen overnight. That's one thing I've learned as a member of the board. We still have our resources are constrained. Redevelopment and regeneration of our buildings is going to be a concern, and putting in more supportive measures for our tenants. Those things are something that are going to be a challenge, but I have such confidence in staff and our board to continue the work that they're doing. In fact, I'm looking forward to our first full board board members this month. We finally have a full board, so I'm going to be looking forward to that. I know, Mr. Chair, we were at an event a couple weeks ago. London Middlesex Housing partnered with Rogers Success Connect for Success, where Rogers is providing high-speed internet service to tenants of low-income housing and not-for-profits at $9.99 per month. So I think that is a partnership that is exciting and adds value and gives value to our tenants. And the importance of We Care is really resonating as we move forward as a board and a corporation. So I just wanted to leave you with those comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to sum up, on behalf of all of City Council, I think it's really clear that that you have our support in the work that you do. I do have to say on behalf of Council, thank you to Councillor Hopkins for taking such a leadership role with this organization on behalf of all of Council, and thank her for the work that she does each and every week and each and every month. And I also want to say that the level of sophistication on your board. The way you're approaching issues is so impressive. This is a very complicated issue, and these are people's lives that we're talking about and their quality of life, and you've taken an equally comprehensive and strategic approach to addressing challenges that have existed in our community for, as Ms. Allen Easton pointed out, generations. And so I think there's reason for optimism here as well, and this is a daunting challenge. You've devoted yourselves as volunteers on a board to address it. You're supported by, as Councillor Hopkins pointed out, very talented and caring staff members. But you're going to be able to do it, and we want to work with you on accomplishing those goals. I see one of the issues that Ms. Allen Easton brought forward was that people didn't think the board was listening, and people didn't think that the board cared. And I love how you've got that language right in your strategic plan, that you are listening and that you do care. And it's extremely clear when you present here today. And so also to Mr. Brown, thank you for your leadership. Dr. Bozzelli, an apology. I called you Mr. earlier in the presentation. I'm sure you worked very hard for a very long time to achieve that. And so it's Dr. Bozzelli from this moment forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the comments, and I'll respond to Mr. as well. It's fine.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. So, colleagues, we're now going to transition to our next meeting. We'll have a motion here to deal with the matter at hand. We'll receive. There's some submissions as well in the added you may see. Yep, it's all up on screen. Moved by Councillor Van Hol, seconded by Councillor Usher. Any discussion? Let's call the question. We're voting.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 10-0.
Colleagues, this brings us to item 4. This is the Housing Development Corporation annual meeting of shareholders and annual resolutions. So if you could please approach the podium, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Your Worship, and members of council.
Just bring it up on the screen.
I am Dick Brouwer, and I'm very pleased to be making this presentation to you, the shareholders, as the chair of the Housing Development Corporation Board of Directors. This is the first presentation from your citizens at large volunteers. Board of Directors. I will start by introducing you the stewardship team and my fellow board members. The treasurer is Larry Hazel. Larry is a director and portfolio manager at High Street Management. The board secretary is Vivian Liu. Vivian is a commercial, real estate and business lawyer with the Siskin law firm. Dan Ross, who is a familiar face in supporting local government, but also represented for his extensive legal and business work in London, including his years with the London Health Science and their Foundation. And of course, Louise Stevens, who joins us as a recognized leader in the housing sector in Ontario, and who was instrumental in helping you to create the Housing Development Corporation. And me. Some of you may know me from my past work as a local business owner and housing developer. And like all boards, we are a diverse group of individuals and share the same passion for affordable housing. Your Worship, the social housing that I knew and grew up in was different than what you see and talk about in Canada. Today's conversation are occupied by issues like the building conditions and repairs, the need for more funding and stock, the impact of outdated systems and rules, and the reluctance of accepting affordable housing in all communities. These are important issues, but like our friends at the London Middlesex Housing Corporation, we know that the real issue is first and always about supporting people in their housing needs and building strong and livable communities. this is what I knew. I didn't call it public housing, or social housing, or affordable housing. It was just housing, all part of our community, regardless who owned it or who funded it. When Council incorporated the Housing Development Corporation just 18 months ago, you recognized that the housing crisis was not going to change on its own, and that you can't buy your way out of the growing issues and crises. You started the movement, and we take our work very seriously. We also know that there is no magic solution. HDC is a mechanism for achieving our goals, not an answer. As the former owner of a local plumbing company that is celebrating 50 years in business this year, and as a former builder and developer, I know that success relies on an ability to act and respond together, to bring teams together, to deliver quality work that provides affordable solutions, and to have the right skills and tools to get it done. When we do, development creates housing for people. They create skills, jobs in our workforce, and they create strong communities for now and for the future. We know that Council is looking for HDC to help advance this work towards our shared community housing vision. Creating affordable, safe housing. Creating strong and inclusive communities. I know you are all familiar with the housing needs in our communities. You hear this from people in your wards, and you see the citywide challenges that are making affordable housing harder to get and harder to keep for a growing population. In the past couple of years, the vacancy rate in one-bedroom rental units has dropped around 1%. CMHC overall average vacancy rate in our area has dropped around 2%. The average over the 10 years leading up to 2015 was almost 4%. And this trend is projected to continue as rental rates increase and more people need affordable units. What is also important is that the housing development market in London is strong. There is opportunities to invest and create new affordable housing and regenerate older social housing stock. Council's decision in allocating funding among so many competing priorities is not simple. Yet, you remain leaders in your investment in affordable housing. Your investment and flexible approach helps HDC to leverage other funds from developers and get greater value out of funding from other governments. The goal is to maximize available affordable rent stock. You recently heard your staff presentation on a housing system based around housing stability. HDC is just one gear in the housing system. As we grow and develop, we know that we must work together with the other parts. LMHC, the city, investors, community organizations, other governments, faith groups, and existing providers, all to create permanent, stable, affordable housing. So, how are we doing, and what will we be doing next to this challenging work? We are using our approved plan for HDC with its goal, strategies, and objectives. And I will walk you through some of these initial activities. Last year, HDC reported to you through a City Hall-led board. So you have already seen the results from the projects completed in 2016, such as 77 Tecumseh, 1166 Hamilton Road, and 337 Commissioners. These are all examples that we've built in 2016. The first goal for HDC was to build on the current programs. Our first strategy toward this goal is the best deployment of our investment. In 2016, you approved our new developments to start at 27 Center Street with 61 units, 356 Dundas Street with 69 units, 516 Albert Street with 31 units, for a total of 161 units. I will try to focus more on what is next. Within these few months in incorporation, HCC was able to display even higher outcomes and new tools and agreements in mixing community developments. This resulted in doubling the value from every dollar that was invested. This will not always be the case, but it showed that being able to negotiate and work together can result in stronger outcomes. What I think is important in this slide is that we are still able to create units with deeper affordability. Rents of around $550 per month, with a mix of units serving people from fixed income seniors and persons with disability and support needs, to low wage earners and people paying market rents, all in a well-constructed new building. This work is not easy. The margins are tight. New developers can struggle. Our work is not without risk and challenges that we continue to manage. Just like other developments, projects can no longer use considerable staff resources. But we're also working hard to mitigate these challenges. Our goal is to work hard with our community partners in a cooperative and fair manner and to ensure developments get completed. Part of investing and building strong housing developments means building our tools. Much of the work in this first year was about setting up administrative tools, the asset transfer and reserve policies. Many of these were administrative tools that will give us the ability to engage and use funds differently in the future. We also look forward to working with the planning office and other city staff in advancing these ideas of a community improvement plan for affordable housing. Like other cities, we encourage you to consider a citywide community improvement plan that will support both new development and regeneration of social housing by considering how municipal fees, development charges, and process improvements can be better incorporated into developments. We also envision a toolbox of programs and services that includes both City Hall-based tools like inclusionary zoning and HCC-based tools so that private developers, non-profit developers, builders, and even homeowners can understand how they can help create new affordable units. The next two strategies deal with the goals of creating new solutions of affordable housing. The first of these strategies is about new revenue generation. The move from a grant to a loan tool exemplifies this. As a revolving loan fund, this new process will help us build longer-term stability for affordable developments. New revenue generation and attraction requires the ability to leverage assets. We thank Council for your staff's work on the surplus and vacant land plans in 2016 and 17. They worked hard with the HCC staff in discussions that resulted in the planning asset transfers of land that you approved at your last meeting. We have already begun exploring how these funds and future sites can be best leveraged in developments. We also look forward to continue to work with your staff on strategies as well as advocacy for these same tools from other governments, including new CMHC and the province. We need your continuing support in these areas. New developments and regeneration will require new financing tools. HDC has been working with others in the sector to create Canada-wide tools to help finance housing development and regeneration plans. We will continue to work with your staff on these issues. Also in 2016, Council's multi-year budget recognizes the need to begin regeneration activities with LMHC, with funding that starts next year. The budget submission that we put together with your Housing Service Office and LMHC recognized that this work should start in 2018. We are working to advance these plans and to begin the initial work on regeneration even earlier. We will also need to work with the city on this as it relates to the financial, planning, and development tools required in this complex work. Regeneration can start, but will not be done quickly. Just like the city's work on asset management, the maintenance of your facilities, the planned regeneration, decommissioning of facilities, and creating new ones takes time and engagements. They are progressive and must happen within a long-term plan. We began these discussions under the shared leadership of LMHC, but we also will be working with the city and your department who have experience in this area. In 2018, we hope to have initial draft plans to move forward in these activities with LMHC and the city. The fourth strategy of innovation should really be considered throughout. Innovation to me means you never stop looking for opportunities. Through our 8 board meetings to date, our learning and discussions have focused on exploring new ways of doing things. One noteworthy change in this area was the creation of a new approach to tendering, which was done under the past and current board. Our new approach is engaged in projects earlier with pre-qualified bidders who apply to work with HDC. This ensures HDC is involved in helping stage projects for their greatest potential. This ensures that we are building the capacity of strong and sustainable non-profit housing providers. We are working with capable builders and developers, and we are able to structure support relationships with expert services providers. Our processes and systems in this area are gaining attention and interest from others across the sector. New developments are costly. We hope to be working with our community to ensure new forms of funding. We have already begun exploring these ideas as a board. And finally, no organization or plan is successful without a strong backbone. We are here as your stewards to work under our shareholders' declaration and business plan to support these challenging strategies. Over the next year, as we gain our sea legs, we see the need for a multi-year capital and operating plan for HDC. One that aligns with the city's multi-year plan, one that aligns with government funding, and that advances various tools and approaches for affordable housing development. So to you, Council, as our shareholder, we are building the toolbox and we are measuring the gears with the other parts of the housing system. These new ways require us to continue to work very closely with your administration. In the coming year, we hope to be part of your inclusionary zoning discussions, expedited development plans, tax tools, secondary suite program, community improvement plans, etc. These are all parts of our shared work. These are not simple. We recognize that your expectation on our organization is to make affordable housing more accessible and more integrated into all communities. We know you have just received our financial audit, which was very helpful in structuring our relationship with your finance office. The shared services of your finance and legal system is critical to the Housing Development Corporation as we begin this work with you. This slide is similar to the one provided at the committee recently during the housing overview. But we added your recent approval of the land transfer, which is an important commitment from Council. These slides provide an overview of the projects that you approved last year, noting the leverage of funds and total investment of $25 million to a combined and approximately 50% government and 50% private investment and mortgage. There is much to do. You may have seen we are in the process of recruiting to help support of the policy and programs and the development work that I talked about. Most importantly, everything we do as part of a housing system approach is intended not to advance the HCC, but to advance the city's local housing strategy and vision. And this team, as you have a great team, I'm proud to be part of this incredible board, and I'm very pleased to be working with the HCC staff. They are energetic and committed about their work. A team that is not political in their work, but they are politically and business astute in their work. Dedicated to advance the best developments in our community. Your worship, council members, like the late JFK once said, we can't stand idly by to expect our dreams to become reality under their own power. The future is not a gift, it is an achievement. Thank you, your worship, council members, for allowing me for this delegation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Brower, for your presentation and also for your work. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we open things up to questions and comments? I'm going to do that now at this time, colleagues. We'll open things up for questions and comments. We were a little long in some of our statements and comments, so I am going to time and hold people to 5 minutes. There were multiple rounds, and so please don't feel offended. I just want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak in the first round. Councillor Squire?
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Chair. I must admit, when I started as a councillor, I had the impression, wrongly or rightly, that we were very siloed in what we did in housing, that people were in their particular area and they were doing work in their area, and other areas maybe were falling behind. And for me, the ultimate example of that was the London Middlesex Housing Corporation. We had an entity that every year we were having to put significant amounts of money into to keep it going. And quite frankly, we weren't delivering a good service to the people who lived in that housing. So I'm gratified that there is going to be work between your organization and London Middlesex Housing Corporation. If there wasn't, I think we would be failing to a great extent in doing what we need to do in housing. So my question to you is, explain to me exactly, so I understand it, because you've sort of explained it in a general way, exactly what you propose to do in your relationship with London Middlesex Housing Corporation and how we might see that reflected in the costs that we're bearing in terms of London Middlesex Housing Corporation, because I want that assurance that there's an understanding in the room that we are an integrated entity, and when the city is throwing a lot of money to support one area, it's difficult, at least for me, to justify giving money in another area.
So, through your worship as chair, we're so integrated
that Josh should be standing beside me right now in how we answer these questions. You're asking to explain in detail what we will be doing next. Ms. Barbone spoke a moment ago about the challenges that you faced in the past about asset strategies as you get into aging assets. I personally don't like the word regeneration. It's the industry term for what we're doing, and even in Mr. Brown's strategy, he spoke to other words. My preference is revitalization, because the first thing that you do is determine what you've got. And we need to be really clear of the 3,282 units within that stock, which is part of 8,085 units in the full social housing stock, which all are dealing with regeneration, not just LMHC. But when you're talking about that full stock, much of it is in very good condition. So the first thing to do is differentiate between what is a social regeneration activity and what is a physical regeneration activity. The reason I say that is because there's buildings within that stock, for example, your high-rise buildings, where the high-rise buildings may require capital work, but they may also be what you leverage. If you have any familiarity with the Toronto Towers project, the Toronto Towers project is still trying to put lifespan around large towers. The reality is that as they age, that doesn't necessarily mean that they become depleted resources. In fact, they have very long lifespans, and they're still trying to estimate probably in advance of 200 years. So what you're doing is the first thing, and I remember you asking me this question, I apologize if I'm going long, but it was a very important question that you asked me in budget last year. And it was, when were we going to start with, when were we going to see with regeneration? And what I have in my head related to regeneration is people look at Regent Park and they love the shiny things that they see at Regent Park. What people don't realize is Don Park was the challenge that Toronto Community Housing Corporation dealt with as their first regeneration project, because, as I think they would admit, they didn't manage the tenant challenges, they didn't manage the building challenges, they didn't manage the reinvestment challenges correctly. And that's not where we want to start. So you start by identifying what's within your stock. LMHC has just made a huge step forward in that with that document that they produced with their asset map. But that asset map doesn't tell you where to start and where not to start. It just gives you a snapshot of where things are. To understand what to leverage is to know where you're going to invest money to be able to retract money out of. So that $225 million may be a different figure when we come back the next time, but that's the first piece. So I'm not going to get beyond that, but I will answer your question to that level of specificity, that the expectation that I think this council needs to have isn't about what is that picture of the next shiny house, because I know that's where we always focus our attention. It's very much more like the process that Mr. Hayward went through over the course of the past 10 years to bring the city's capital assets into a plan and know, what are you commissioning, what are you decommissioning, what are you investing in to keep it stronger, and always recognizing that every building that we're talking about has people living in them right now. So I hope that provides in detail. There's a financial strategy, there's a building mapping strategy, there's a tenant mapping strategy, an engagement strategy. Some of those will be very much the work of LMHC. Some of those will be the work of HDC. And we will do that within a team. We will establish for LMHC specifically, so knowing that there's 63 other social housing providers in the city. But with LMHC and the scope and magnitude of LMHC, we would set up a special team effort between us, the service manager, and LMHC.
I think the priority, at least for me, is to know that you're working together. Certainly as a counselor, I trust that you're all professionals and know what you're doing. I think my concern is if people come back and say you're not doing it, or you're not pursuing it, or there's a roadblock, or we don't see improvement. That's where I get concerned. But I certainly have faith that from what I've heard today, you're going to be working together, and I hope we see the benefits of that. Probably not within this term of council. I understand it's long term, but at least we're moving in the right direction, and I do appreciate that.
Thank you. Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks very much for the presentation. I certainly appreciate it. I like the direction that we're going. I think it spells it out, and it gets a little clearer each time. After all, this is a new entity. And I don't want to use the word feeling our way, but we are progressing and we're evolving. And I think that when I first heard about the HDC, I always thought it was going to be isolated, and I don't like the word silo, but in essence. So what I'm hearing here today, I'm very, very happy to hear that. There is one little piece from my perspective that is missing, and that is the part that Mrs. Data's Bear organization plays in all this. Can somebody, through you, Mr. Chair, fill me in on this? Perhaps she can.
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Councillor Usher. I think it's important to remember that the City of London is the service manager for housing in our community. So ultimately, the responsibility for everything that happens in housing, whether it relates to homelessness, which my colleague, Ms. Livingston, is responsible for, or for the delivery of social housing and affordable housing, rests with the city as the service manager. What we have done, and in your role as a shareholder, we have both our relationship with London Middlesex Housing Corporation, which delivers the social housing on your behalf as a shareholder, and also now the affordable housing piece of the work that HDC does on your behalf as a shareholder. Housing Division continues to look after our social housing piece of work. The other 62 or 63, I think it's 62 housing providers in our community, it works in collaboration with LMHC on the work that it does in providing social housing, in the work that Mr. Justasia and his board does in development of new housing. But we also work in collaboration with Ms. Livingston on her work on the housing and homelessness plan, and specifically around homeless prevention. So I think civic administration is ultimately accountable, and then thus to you as the shareholder. But ultimately, the Housing Division has the responsibility for housing and working with our partners.
And I think, Mr. Chair and colleagues, that's very important for us to understand. It's not just two entities. It's a big entity out there, and you have these different segments working together. And for me, it's very, very important that we get them, that we understand that they're working together, so that we know that nobody is left out. You had something you wanted to add? Okay, no, I thought you. Mr. Chair, through you, I just have a couple of quick questions. I don't want to elaborate on what I want, but the last time when staff came here, we advised you to write a letter, and I think that letter that will be approved tomorrow. But I think that when we write that letter, we need to be able to put it in context of the entire picture. I'll bring it up again tomorrow when we talk about it, because when we go to the federal government and the federal government begins to do their national housing strategy, I think it's important that they understand what we are doing in London and how we are coping with this. I think it's very important. I also, through you, Mr. Chair, I mentioned this before, that I had a discussion through staff and myself speaking to one of the vice president of the federal CMHC, I think it was. And one of the things that he talked about is that there will be money available for innovation. And I'm sure that you have heard of this before. Do you, and I know that you have something here about innovation, but I think that they're thinking in a larger context, innovative approaches, innovative type housing. Can you address that by any chance?
Through the chair, there's a number of tools coming out from CMHC, and they're happening in part through the federal budget. And I think we're going to see more tools coming out probably later in this year. I'm guessing around November, around National Housing Day, where what CMHC is doing is and this goes to the context of your letter, I believe, is that we are calling on them to bring back their portfolio of tools that they once had available that inspired affordable housing development. One of the tools that they've already announced, actually they've announced a few tools already, some mortgage tools, some seed funding changes, so we've already made application to some of those tools already to be able to use some of that money. The innovation tool is fairly specific. We will be, not only are we looking at which of our partners could access those funds, but we also work very closely with CMHC. So the great news, I think, is, and I know that you know our regional CMHC friend who has been phenomenal to this city, we've worked very closely on helping to support and define any effort to bring in some of these new tools with CMHC. So not all of them will be able to be used right away. I think there's only been a couple of allocations within the new innovation fund across the country. And we're starting to learn what innovation means. I think Mr. Brower, who said it best a minute ago, is it means that we're always looking for new opportunities.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that. I have other questions, but I'll leave it for now, Mr. Chair, to others. And again, I want to thank them for the presentation. And I want to thank the staff also in both set of staffs, ours, LMHC, and yours, because they all work hard in this. And it's nice to know that we still have the same core of people who have been doing well in this over the years. And I'm glad that they have the right input to this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Usher. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to follow up on Councillor Squire's question, because it was a great question getting back to London Middlesex Housing Corporation. And I appreciate your answer as well. I will no longer use the word regenerate, revitalize. is something that revitalize, I understand there is a difference in the way we use our words is important. But I would like to put on my board hat here with the London Middlesex Housing Corporation. And you did say, where do we start? And I would like to ask, where do we start with our relationship? I understand the other part, but as we move into 2017, 2018, when you will be looking at partnering with London Middlesex Housing Corporation, in its, I guess, simplistic form, where does our relationship start?
So through the chair, the easiest place to answer is to say nothing is simplistic on when we're getting into regeneration. And I don't mean to be provocative in saying that. What I mean to say is that Toronto Community Housing Corporation has 8 subsidiary companies, I think, or more, at least 6 of which are related to regeneration activities. And so where we start is we start by understanding not just where, but the how. The governance tools that will be involved in separating out, and we will be working not only with Ms. Daters-Beer, but we'll be working with the city on these things to make sure that we're protecting your authority, not just as your 2 hats, in both of the hats that you wear. And so some of that will be up, and Josh and I have already, Mr. Brown, your CEO, and I have already had conversations related to this. And what I was just saying to Mr. Basile, your board chair, is that I envision a time where our boards are meeting together on these things and actually doing some of these early introductions. But to do that, I think it's only right that you have a framework. Mr. Morgan asked a moment ago, where do we come in? I think the biggest place that you come in is not necessarily in the back and forths on the broader picture, but you're going to be coming in as the shareholder in multiple ways. Mr. Brown talked about the need for shareholder revisions. There may be needs for revisions specific to certain regeneration activities. So I think this is where we're working not only with Ms. Daters-Beer, but with the city, their financial team, our own individual boards, and you're going to be seeing decisions at this level related to what did the structure of those look like. And I envision that when Mr. Brown is saying we're going to be coming back at the end of this year, you're going to be seeing various iterations of this as we go through a planning cycle together. And I think that's what I'm looking forward to is, you know, what's that first iteration going to look like? What's the second iteration going to look like? It's not as simple, but we're going to try to make it as simple as we can.
If I could just make a follow-up comment, I agree it's not simple. As a board member, I'm trying to envision and trying to see this relationship. And I'm looking forward that the board's meeting together, because that is, I think, the beginning of a relationship. We have to meet to move forward. So look forward to it.
Thank you, Councillor. I have Councillors Ridley, Helmer, and Van Holst.
Thank you. My questions are more specific to the accounting and the reports rather than the vision of the HTC. And so my first question is in regards to the audited statement and just looking for some help to understand, because in the report I saw some federal and provincial funding. I don't see that reflected in the audited statement. Could you let me know where I would see that reflected for the 2016 federal and provincial contributions?
Through the chair, I'm just going to confirm with finance on this. I believe this is the cash flow related to the municipal costing, but let me just take a look for 2016. I believe the reason why you're not seeing that is because the federal provincial funding all would have been allocated at that time through the city side. So you're not seeing it on this on this statement. In the course of the next probably in the course of the next meeting cycle, you're going to be seeing a delegation of authority. So what you're seeing is the provincial money is coming in through our administrative line right now on this for the administrative funding. Once we do that delegation of provincial authority through Ms. Dadersbeer, you're going to see those numbers hit our books differently in the 2017 calendar year.
Thank you. A couple follow-ups just because I want to be really clear, because I thought part of the intent with having the HDC was to segregate and separate the municipality from the HDC. So are those multi-level government funds still going to flow through the city back to the HDC?
Through the chair, we'll be reporting back on the mechanism. We actually had a report back October of 2016, I believe, and 2015 on the delegation of authority. The way that will work is basically what the municipality will be doing, and I'd ask Ms. Dadersbeer and Ms. Barbone to fill in any gaps here, is that the city will be delegating its function of service manager specific to the role that the HDC plays out, so the capital build portion of our operation. That delegation will then fully separate out the activities of the province through the service manager. It's everything that we do is governed under our shareholder agreement. So, you know, you are still our shareholder in every way. You are still the overall service manager. That will be the final piece that you parse out. You've already parsed out the asset transfers, the municipal funding. That's the only piece that's left. So organizationally, we are a special purpose body under the Municipal Act. We're a business corporation, so we are independent in those respects. But that piece we're still working on, and we will have that to you by the next cycle.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. And so then my other question is just clarification on the slide deck, and probably about 6 slides back, the financial overview. Can you just clarify for me if that is 2016 or 2017? Because I just see conflicting numbers in the title and then the header. So it says 2016 financial overview, then it says amount for 2017. So can you just clear that up?
Through the chair, noting that the slide isn't the financial statement, so thank you for pointing that out. This slide was the similar slide that you received last year, knowing that last meeting cycle through the Community and Protective Services Committee, the Housing 101 presentation that Ms. Dadersbeer and Ms. Livingston did. So these are actually 2016 and 17. So in 17, the two numbers that are specific to 17 is the one-time capital, the 1.6, and the other one that's specific to 2017 is the 740,000 in the surplus land transfer. And the other ones I should point out are ballparked. I believe there may be minor variances. And again, your budget numbers vary from, as the auditors always point out to us, they always vary from the audited statements.
Sir Helmer and then Van Holst.
Thank you, and I know the first year of getting something up and running can be a bit difficult, and I'm glad to see that it's gone quite well, as you can see from the presentation. Thank you to the volunteer members who stepped forward to serve on the Housing Development Corporation. It's, I think, an exciting new development. I did want to ask some questions about Goal 2, Strategy 4, and I hope you will take it the right way. So I read this slide and I listened to what you were saying, And I didn't really understand any of it. So, and part of that is because there's this very specific jargon that is used in housing, and especially at the Housing Development Corporation. And I think sometimes you use the words expecting everybody's going to know what you mean. And I got to tell you, especially just reading the slide in advance, there's a housing bank, and I don't really know too much about that. There's the Housing Foundation. I don't know what that means. There's all this references to tools, and sometimes when you're saying tools, I think you mean programs. But it's used in a variety of different contexts, and it's very confusing, frankly, for especially people who might not be paying attention to it all the time. So across the organization, we're obviously trying to improve plain language communications. I know that you're working in this slide with very limited space, and you're trying to give like a high-level overview. And frankly, what Mr. Brower is saying helped in terms of understanding what is there. But I just wanted to give you that feedback. For example, when it says work with the city on a catalog of tools supporting affordable housing. Is that like a list of things that people can apply for so they can build affordable housing? I don't know. So if you could try and make it as simple as possible so that folks like myself can follow along, I think it would be helpful. Because really, especially on the areas where you're talking about innovation and new stuff, that's where I find the jargon gets really heavy.
Through the chair, if I could, I'd like to respond to that first by absolutely agreeing and appreciating that feedback in an immense way, and also sharing that it's not been so long since I was in that same spot. I realize that it can be very jargony, and I can be very jargony. And part of it is also the move that the sector is making. And the analogy that I would use is that if you were looking at the health sector, and you were talking about what's the role of a foundation in the health sector, we sort of have this image of how foundations play a part in leveraging funding toward capital in the health sector. Well, I think that is not a program. That is actually a financial tool. It may actually be a mechanism that we use collectively as a community. The other one on the bank idea, and I'll just leave it at there because I think those are two that you picked up that are absolutely jargon. And I fully own the fact that they're jargon. But they're also pieces that I think we need to get into our shared vocabulary a little bit in some other way, perhaps. The bank notion is that as we get into regeneration, as we get into new development, we are one of thousands of cities across this country that are going through the same thing. Yet we haven't looked at how do we aggregate some of this work. So one of the first things I did is I looked to who are the leaders in the sector. And we started partnering in with leaders across the country who were doing the same kind of work. And we realized that there was a need for a financial instrument that we could use, similar to the way, if you think about infrastructure, how the federal government has moved infrastructure investment. So we are looking at those kinds of tools that aren't just local tools. They're actually tools that will work across the country. Some of them may be programs, some of them might be things that are delivered, but if you look in the federal budget, the 2016 federal budget, you'll have noticed that there was, I think, $2.5 billion over 5 years to a housing loan fund. Well, they're doing the same thing. Their housing loan fund has no definition yet, but what we're saying is that's exactly what the sector needs, and that's what our feedback to the federal government was. We need you to have funding so that when we're doing this work, we can actually use it collectively, not just London, across the country.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, and through the chair to our guests, I wanted to ask about the prospects of short-term housing. It seems our long-term plan is very hopeful. But just in the answers, I got the impression that providing some more housing to people in the short term is not as hopeful. And perhaps you'd just speak to that.
Well, I think when you're talking about answers to short-term housing, and when I talked about a catalog or a toolkit, that's really what I'm talking about, is that part of my work is to invest in changes. It's like when you're having conversations about health or transit or whatever the conversation is. You're not just planning for what you need today, you're planning for what you're going to need in 20 years. And the today's solutions, you know, when we're doing a build may take 2-3 years to get to fruition. Well, that's where you have supplement programs. That's where you have other programs that are not just in HDC. There are programs that are available through the service manager. There's programs that are available through the health sector. And part of what I see needed is being able to assemble these tools. Some of them are tools that you've been making decisions about over the course of the last year. Secondary suites, the planning tools that we'll be seeing through inclusionary zoning. Some of those will be able to mobilize product quicker than others. So I think in the short term, our solutions aren't, you know, you can't build for tomorrow. You can build for a year or two down the road. If you're looking at solutions for right now, they are, I think, by and large through the supplements and allowance programs. They are challenging though, because the rental market is moving.
Thank you. And are there any things that we could be doing with the HDC that we haven't thought of or just wouldn't typically think of?
Well, through the chair, I think the answer to that is only yes, but I also haven't thought of them. So I think part of coming back to you with a multi-year plan that then matches in with the city's multi-year plan is to start exploring what are some of those new ideas, what are some of those. So, you know, the idea that when we came forward to you with the HDC as an idea, we called it a lean startup. What that really means is that, and you've acknowledged it, we're taking baby steps. So I think the openness to ideas, we're always open to ideas. So they're going to come from everywhere.
Thank you.
Other speakers for the first round? No other speakers. Councillor Usher, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just very quickly, I sense a little bit of my explanation, but I was interested in this housing bank. And you talk about the federal government, $2.5 billion housing bank. The federal government also has a $15 billion infrastructure bank. And I'm not sure where that housing bank is with relation to the infrastructure bank and where ours fit in. Do you have a sense of that?
Through the chair, we don't have a sense of how they will, what the governance will look like. So not only does the federal government have an infrastructure bank, they also have CMHC. There's limitations and there's positives. Those are things I think we will see out of the national housing strategy. How they deliver is different than what they deliver. So part of what we've been advocating for, and I think you've probably heard about it because we've also advocated through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, AMO, the large urban city mayors, for these kinds of tools. So I'm not sure what the structure of it is, and I should be careful that calling it a bank means a specific thing. So it really is creating the financial tools that we need on a national level.
So, Mr. Chair, I just want to go back to the statement I made. When we write that letter, I just want to be sure that the letter is all-encompassing for the minister to understand where we are at and what we would like answer to. I think it's important that we don't just focus on one little portion of it. I'm sure that you would agree with that because the big city mayors have talked about this, FCM have talked about it. Now it's our turn to give our direct request. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and absolutely. Those are the conversations that I've had with the Minister, Mr. Sohi, as well. And really, the response from the federal government is stay tuned. They're working on it. They've made significant commitments, and now they've got to follow through with the details. Yeah, but we'll incorporate that into the letter, absolutely. Any other comments, colleagues? Any other questions? With that, then, Councillor Morgan.
Thank you. First off, thank you very much for the presentation and to my colleagues for asking really great questions. That way I don't have very many. In fact, I just have a comment and one question. The comment is I'm really glad to hear both the presentations together, that notion of partnership. A number of my colleagues mentioned it, but I think that's something that's really exciting. I know that we're the shareholder of both, and so actually having these on the same day is very advantageous to us, getting, I think, a much wider picture of both the scope of what both organizations do, the plans for the future, as well as, you know, the ways that they can work together. And I really like the idea of those boards coming together, you know, irrespective of the shareholder on that collaboration. So that's my comment. So great work. The question I have to ask, and it's a clarification question, is a couple weeks ago, about a month, we gave an additional $1.6 million to the Housing Development Corporation. During the debate, there was lots of impressions given on what would be done and when with that money. We added a request to our civic administration to report back on that specific matter at key points during the year. I just would like this is the first opportunity that I've had to engage formally on this. Any clarification you can add on exactly how that money is expected to be used, so that any expectations or misinterpretations by the public on what that money is going to be used for can be, you know, put to rest, and some clarity can be made, even if that answer is it'll be in the future plans. I just want to be clear on what's happening with that.
Through the chair, I also want to be clear on that one point, the $2 million ask. I know that there was a part of the resolution that came back about the difference. I didn't speak to that, and civic administration didn't speak to that, because we were still working on part of that difference. I think that resolution, that portion of the resolution may now be moot, just given the fact that we were working with Annalisa Barbon's team in finance regarding surplus lands. So we knew that we actually had other strategies in the work, but they aren't one versus the other. So in fact, you've already allocated an additional $740,000 in land asset transfer value to HDC, specifically on the 1.6 million. The intent of that 1.6 million was that we knew that the federal and provincial governments had leveraged more money, had issued more money toward affordable housing development late in 2016. We had not yet, and I think Councillor Helmer had said at the time, we should have brought this debate to more fruition during the budget process, and not having postponed it to the surplus conversation. And I totally understood that, and I think that I tended to agree that it seemed out of sorts that we were asking for 1.6 million, but the intent, if we go back to the business case, was related to the additional federal provincial money that we were getting. And that money is right now on the street with an RFP. It's a closed RFP to our rostered bidders. So the intent is that you've now given us a bit more money to leverage in development. You've also, through your land transfer, provided us opportunity for development. So now what we have is we're starting to build a toolbox, if you will, sorry, Councillor Helmer, but that is the toolbox, right? You're starting to see different solutions. You're seeing a land surplus solution. You're seeing a surplus revenue solution that helps us. With that, we intend to bring in more private equity and mortgage. So how we do that could also extend not only to the developments that we're doing right now, but it could also extend to some of the new programs that are coming through the Planning Act.
Thanks, I appreciate that, and I hope you appreciate that I asked today for the sake of clarity, and I think your answer provided a lot more clarity of scope, both on that money as well as, I'm glad you brought in the land, transferring the land from the city to the Housing Development Corporation, because that was something that went through corporate services. I think everybody was supportive of. So I appreciate the clarification, and you know, whether or not we need to report back on that will be up to our staff and how they bring it forward. But thank you for taking the time to clarify. And again, great presentation, and I appreciate the information you provided, and I think my colleagues made great comments.
Good. Well, I have no additional speakers, and so with that, I think it's just time to say on behalf of council, thank you for the work that you do, both on the staff side of the equation and certainly on the board volunteer side of the equation. Your lived experience in this industry is going to prove to be invaluable as we embark upon a direction that very few have gone before. Sounds almost like Star Trek, and it's very exciting because I think about the work that Susan Eagle did, that Councillor Usher did over a decade ago, and London was seen as being very progressive in this space, and this really is 2.0. And the Housing Development Corporation allows us more options. I won't use the word tools, Councillor Helmer, but more options and programs and a more nimble approach, a more creative approach that is going to, again, help work with our other community partners to address the great challenge that we're faced with and that communities from right across Canada are faced with. So thank you very much for your work. It's been a while since I've been able to work a Star Trek reference into a meeting, so thanks everyone for their patience with me. We'll look for a motion then to receive. It's up on screen. It's been moved by Councillor Usher and seconded by Councillor Cassidy. Let's call the question. We're voting.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 10-0.
Okay, brings us to item 5. This is consideration for appointment to the London Public Library Board. They're requiring one board member at this point. I imagine, colleagues, you'll want to take the discussion either in the direction of a ranked ballot this evening or perhaps an opportunity to interview as well. I'm just looking for speakers on that to get a sense of where the committee would like to go. Okay, I'm going to look at ranked ballot then as the direction that we're going to be taking, unless someone wants to provide a different motion that would introduce interviews in this process. Okay, so we'll move to ranked ballots. Clerk Saunders is trying to get my attention, so I'm going to hand things over to her.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I received an email indicating that Mr. Ferrari wishes to withdraw his name from nomination for this position.
Just looking to see if the clerk can confirm that all ballots have been submitted at this point. Okay. And then, colleagues, what we'll do once we've submitted these ballots is we'll move to the next agenda item. We'll, again, if there's a interest in moving to a ranked ballot this evening, we'll do that. We'll leave that information with the city clerk and take a dinner break, and we'll resume the meeting once the results have been tallied. Okay, colleagues, change of plans. We are going to tally the results on 5. We'll take a dinner break in a few moments, but I've just been reminded that with item 6, we have 2 members who we've already provided direction to be interviewed for appointment. And at the time, we had asked staff to circulate and see if there were any other members of the community interested. And so what the decision that we need to make tonight to follow along on the path that we set in motion on April 18th is review these names and see if there are any names that we'd like added to that interview list. Once we're through that process, then they can be invited to participate in the interview. So I'm not sure if anyone has a name they want to bring forward, if there's going to be extensive debate. If there is going to be extensive debate, that's fine. We'll just take a dinner break. We'll come back and we'll deal with it in about 20 or 30 minutes. Councillor Usher?
I have some names that I'd like to add.
Did you want to just toss them out there?
Sure. Ready? I'd like to add Larry Ducharme,
okay,
Andrew Hirmack, and Harry Justin.
Larry Ducharme, Andrew Hirmack, and the last again?
Harry Justin.
Harry Justin, yep, absolutely. Okay, are there other names that people are interested in adding? We can deal with these sort of vote by vote. I want to just make sure we've got everything on the table. Councillor Helmer?
Thank you. Last time we dealt with selecting people for interview for appointment to London Hydro Board of Directors, we did a ranked ballot to narrow down to their short list. Yeah. And so as long as that's what we're talking about, is sort of putting people on a ballot so we can then vote on it, that's fine. But I'm hoping that we're not trying to interview all of these people.
Did you have a number in mind for the short list, expand the list from 2 to 4 interviews, for example?
You might recall that last time we decided on 3. I actually tried to change that to 4, and that was not successful. We ended up interviewing 3.
Here's your opportunity to go to 4. Okay.
I'm going to try 3 again. I think we should really just pick one more person to roll in to the interviews with the other candidates.
Okay. Okay. So other names that we'll bring forward. We are going to take a dinner break as well. Yeah, go ahead.
What are the names on the list?
So they're on the agenda, on page 2 of the agenda under item 6, listed C through J.
So if.
Oh, I'm sorry, the other two names would be Mr. G. Holborn and Ms. M. Parks.
And is Sol Morrison on the list?
Saul is not at this time, so would you like to continue?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So what we'll do then is we'll move into the ranked ballot process. I think that's how we can narrow this process down. We'll do our vote, and then we'll take a dinner break. But it's been suggested by one committee member that we only select one person out of that process. That's a debate that we can have after the dinner break. This will just give us the rankings. And so why don't we distribute the ballots now? We'll make the vote, take a break, and come back and debate the issue. Nope, the whole ballot. Yeah. So I've just heard a couple councillors asking about the process. It's worth reviewing. This will simply rank the names. We'll debate after the dinner break how many names that we will interview. Go ahead, councillor.
We will include the former two also in that ranking, right? Thank you.
No, that's a decided matter of council. We've already identified those two for interview, and now we're identifying an undetermined number more at this point. Yeah.
Just a point of information, I guess. For my colleagues, if anybody needs to leave, they need to let the clerks know, because at Corporate Services Committee, we ran into the situation where a colleague had to leave, and then that cannot be used in the ranking, and so they would actually have to reconstruct the entire ballot, taking more time. So if someone needs to do that, they need to let the clerk know so that ballot isn't counted. We don't end up having to count it twice.
Thank you for raising that, Councillor Morgan. And it happened, I think, on a couple of occasions at that meeting, and it created some additional work for the clerk. Councillor Ridley?
Thank you. I wouldn't mind the chair and clerk making a ruling on that, because I also remember a discussion saying that the ranking was purely a tool and was not the vote. So the preference in the ranking was simply a tool to narrow down the will of council, but the vote was the binding matter that needed people there.
So we're still brand new at this, and for those watching from home, I can understand how this could be confusing. It is worth going to Clerk Saunders so she can review the recommendation that she made and the ruling that I made as related to the ranked ballot. And should a member, if they fill out the ballot while participating in a meeting, do they need to remain for the entire agenda item?
Through Mr. Chair, my advice is yes, they would need to be there because the ranked ballot process and the information showing the process as to how we got there is part of the record. So it's all part leading into the vote, and in my opinion, the council should remain throughout the whole process.
And again, for those watching from home, that was the recommendation that was provided at CSC, and that was the direction that was taken. Councillor Ridley, you have the floor? No? Okay. So I think we've handed all of the ballots in. It's 6:30, right on time for that dinner break. Let's break as quickly as we can. I'm hoping that we can be back in session about 10 to or at 7 o'clock, but I want to provide the clerks with an opportunity to develop the ballot process and also get a bit of a break as well. And so if they need some time to get a bite to eat, then we'll make that time as well. So a quick motion, please, to, thank you very much, to recess, moved by Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Usher. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? See you as soon as we can. Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. This is item 7, second report of the governance working group. Have a motion come up on screen. Any speakers? We could have a mover. Thank you, Councillor Ridley, seconded by Councillor Helmer, and first on the speakers list is Councillor Helmer.
Hopefully, if these changes go through, I can tell you we had quite a extensive discussion at the working group and saved the whole committee from having to do that, which I think was a good use of our time. If this goes through at council, we'll be able to use our cell phones in the meetings, which is great. Great step forward.
Other speakers? Let's call the question. Voting.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 10-0.
And this is item 8. Councillor Van Holst, did you want to say a few words?
Oh, no, just looking forward to being part of the group. I've come out many times, and so I thought I would be an official group. I think I've got something to add. I'm a person who likes to think outside the socks.
Moved by Councillor Hopkins. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Ridley. Any discussion? Let's call the question.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 10-0.
Thanks very much, Councillor, for putting your name forward. And Clerk Saunders, are you ready to go? Amazing. That was outstanding time.
We only have the library done. Based on the ranked ballot process, Michelle Boyce is the successful person.
Okay, thank you very much, Clerk Saunders. If we can get that to come up on screen once Ms. Westlake Power has a chance to type the motion. Councillor Usher.
Do you want to start that? Mr. Chair, I know that one of our members suggested one, but did we agree that it would only be one?
This is for the library board. There's one seat available at this time, so we're identifying that member. Mm-hmm. Okay, Councillor Salih is going to move this. Seconded by, thank you, Councillor Helmer. Any discussion? Let's call the question. Voting.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 10-0.
And Clerk Saunders, are you ready with the second ranked ballot? You haven't started that one. Okay, so I'll look for a motion for recess then, please. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Van Holst. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Got one opposed, two opposed. I mean, for the people voting opposed, the motion carries, but do you have a suggestion then? Because this is a process that we've all agreed to, and I know it's getting late in the meeting. Are you looking to refer this to another meeting, or Councillor Salih?
So I don't really have to justify why I'm opposed to something, but since you asked through the chair, I think my preference would be moving forward if we can perhaps have make our submissions earlier. I think maybe that may be streamlined a little bit sooner. I'm sure we'll continue to still be open to persuasion at the time of vote, but I think that just makes it more efficient for the meeting.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that, and this is an encumbered procedure. We need to do the ranked ballot at the vote, at the open meeting, and so that then it can be a part of the process. I dream of the day when we have software that the clerk's office is comfortable with and that we can use, because then it would be essentially light speed. So, Councillor Ridley.
Thank you. And I think perhaps maybe what I heard my colleague say, which maybe wasn't the same as what you heard, Mr. Chair, was even at the beginning of the meeting, if we casted our ballots then we continue through the course of business throughout the meeting. So not necessarily ahead of the meeting, but if that's the first order of business, and then we can continue on with those scheduled items, I think then we would have results ready when we get through our other items.
I think that's an exceptional idea. Councillor Sleeser, I misunderstood what you were saying. What we'll do is we'll ask that another member of the clerk's team be present so that they can tabulate the results while the meeting is occurring. Okay. So we're recessed. I imagine, Ms. Saunders, do you have a time estimate that you require? 20 minutes. Okay. So we'll resume then at 7:35. Okay, I called him. We'll call the meeting to order, back into agenda item 6. So the clerks have been able to reduce this number to 2. And you'll recall that we haven't debated the number of people that we are going to interview. I'll just ask Ms. Westlake Power to read out the 2 names that have registered as 1 and 2. And you could indicate where they are in the ranking. Oh, here's Ms. Saunders. If you could do that, please, Ms. Saunders.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The 2 names remaining are Andrew Hiremack and Harry Jolston.
Excellent, thank you. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. I'd like to move that we interview both individuals.
And that's seconded by Councillor Usher. Any discussion on that? Okay, we'll wait for that to come up on screen. I have Councillor Ridley.
Thank you. Just hoping for a very brief explanation as to why there's some rankings of 1, 2, and some 8s. If we're down to just 2 members, if I could understand that, that would be helpful.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's because not all members of council ranked 1 to 8, and any of the ones that didn't rank 8, anyone that was left blank got an automatically 8, and we didn't remove those 8s through the process.
Great. So the motion is up on screen, I believe. It's been moved by Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Cassidy on screen. Any further discussion? Let's call the question. We're voting.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 10 to 0.
Mr. Houston, thank you very much for your patience this evening. Thanks for putting your name forward. The clerk's office will be in touch to schedule that interview. And I'll now move to deferred matters or additional business. Councillor Ridley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am frustrated tonight at the process by which our ranked ballot system worked. I'm frustrated that it was unclear to me, and it appears that it's at the call of the chair as to how things will work. So at times, everyone had to rank every participant. Other times, there's limited participants ranked. I feel that we need a very clear policy on how this is implemented so that it is consistent across the board, and so that when I vote and rank every candidate and my neighbor votes and only ranks 1 candidate, those are weighted differently, and I don't find that to be appropriate. So this time, I would like to make a motion to send this to Governance Working Group to develop an appropriate policy on how ranked balloting will work that will be applied to all of our committees moving forward. I think that's the only fair way to do this. I think it's a good system. I think it's reflective of the council, but it needs to be applied consistently and not at the will of different chairs.
I'd be pleased to second that motion. I think that, again, this evening, we see this as a system that's evolving. There was some frustration in the room, and also this is a good indicator that we need to get this right if we're moving to ranked balloting in the municipal election as well. And so we'll send that to governance if this passes. I'm happy to second it. I'll look for other speakers. Yep, Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I'll certainly support the motion because we should review this. I'll tell you what the problem is, though. There's a couple problems that happened tonight. One is we weren't clear on how many people to rank for the clerk, and so she basically had to record and develop each round of voting so that she was prepared. If we said we wanted to interview 4 people, she had to be able to go backwards and do that. The second thing, too, is that we're not being consistent in the way that we're doing this. At the very start, when we did ranked balloting at the committee, we actually threw out, I think, Councillor Turner's vote because he didn't rank the whole thing as a spoiled ballot. Then we moved to allowing people ranked as many as we want. At one point during the discussion, I remember saying this very clearly, I emphasized that a ranked ballot with 10, we have 10 people choosing from amongst 15 others. That's too many. Ranked ballots work very well when you have lots of voters and few people to choose from. So in the past, what we've done is we've gone around and we've taken nominations, and then we haven't ranked the people that no one's interested in ranking. We basically had a set of 5 or 6 candidates. Those are when it worked very well, but we seem to have let it just go into a situation where we don't really have a process, and all this is supposed to be is a tool to allow us to narrow things down a little quicker. So I think having this, those parameters defined, because there are ways that it can work very well in this sort of situation. There's ways where it doesn't work well at all. And the ways where it doesn't work well at all is the way that we're actually doing it right now, because we're not being consistent. We're ranking, we have way too many candidates for the number of voters we have, and we're basically not even ranking the whole slate. And so we're actually, I can tell you, we're actually disadvantaging people who aren't ranked because of the way we eliminate the candidates. We're basically assigning them the highest possible number we can, and then they're getting eliminated potentially for no good reason because they have a high number with a bunch of low numbers, and that's just bumping them out from someone else. So those are problems that need to be fixed. We've talked about them a couple of points through the process, but I think we just have to fix this or move to a completely different system for committee selections, because this is meant to help, not slow things down.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just point out that we're very close to having a technical solution for this, and that should solve, address all the problems that I've heard today. But so that's on its way.
Other speakers? Yeah. Councillor Squire.
Yeah, I just think it's great that we could have been done and finished just after 6:30. We're now here at 20 to 8 still debating about a ranked ballot system and how great it could work if we got it right. I think it's just, it demeans us as a council, makes us look silly, and I have to smile. That's all I can do.
Other speakers? A question before we call the vote? Councillor Usher? Let's call the question. Let's see. We're voting.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 9-1.
I'd like to publicly thank both of our clerk staff here today. I know that for us it was a frustrating evening, and I'm sure it was for staff as well. We get to say that we're frustrated, they don't. And so thank you very much for your patience, for working through dinner to make this happen. And I'll now look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Salih, second by Councillor Cassidy. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion carries. See everybody tomorrow night.